humans were young by galactic standards when we discovered their system. Though we thought them much younger, most species band together and begin expanding into other worlds within their systems shortly after they develop a way to communicate across large distances. But the humans had spent most of their time and energy fighting each other on their one little rock. On the grand scale of things, this was not uncommon, but most species died out entirely before they achieved spaceflight at all when they were so violent. Humans had somehow managed to not only continue, but thrive despite their warlike nature. All the classic signs of a war culture were there: tales of glory and battle, large investment of time and effort into instruments of death, and even smaller competitive battles for entertainment and sport. It was common among them to do battle barehanded and then laugh and drink together afterward. But they were less barbaric than most other warrior races. When a member of their race was born deformed, they wouldn't simply smash it upon the rocks, or even end its life with a chemical, as had been my race's practice before we were brought into the Empire to be researchers. No, they had systems in place to care for those born this way through the totality of their lives. Not well, but care nonetheless. My initial research seemed incredibly promising. Humans had a well above average strength-to-mass ratio, a mass large enough to be intimidating, but not so large to require redesign of the ships. They could survive a vast range of temperatures given the right equipment, and adapt to deficient levels of their required sustainment chemicals, even the atmospheric ones. Their nutrient consumption requirements were comparatively lower than other species of similar size. They operated in groups often, but were capable of independent thought and action. They had even developed a near omni-directional vehicle for use in their warfare. And while it did seem to require extensive training, they didn't cast breed to create those capable of flying it. That was perhaps the most impressive thing about humanity. On average, any human could be capable of almost any task. None of them were born specialized. The humans even thought they selected their own leaders. At first, this seemed incorrect, and I had assumed caste breeding, but it turns out the leaders were selected by something humans referred to as money. It's been explained to me several times, but I still can't quite wrap my head around it. When I brought my reports to my superiors, they were just as hopeful as I was. The Nix Hill Empire was made of several races brought together from many worlds, but did not have a warrior race, and were it not for our scientific prowess, we would have been conquered several times over by now. Unfortunately, the Keth Empire had not been swayed by our offers of trade and were beginning to push into our territory at an alarming rate. Humans could be the turning point for us. Our ships entered orbit and broadcast a message to the entire world in all the languages we had been able to learn. We come in peace. It seemed a wise choice considering they had several stories of glorious battles against unknown species. Though we suspected these were works of fiction, we received a response inviting us to something they called the United Nations, though it seemed far from united. Our offer was rather simple: join our empire and serve as our warriors. We explained our advanced technology, our willingness to allow them access to it, and even our willingness to adopt their existing military structures. Why would we tell the warriors how to make war? That seemed silly. The leaders at the United Nations weighed our proposal and deliberated until Zaknar, my superior, became bored. Quite a feat if I do say so. Zaknar was a Trillan, a race that was raised from infancy for complex problems. They didn't even have appendages. They used psychic powers to move things so as not to let their minds weaken. It was Zaknar's idea to broadcast the offer to the entire world, rather than just this small chamber of human leaders. Set up something the humans already had for their military recruiting stations. The public response was enormous. Millions of humans were flooding into the makeshift tables we had set up in every major city. Humans from every corner of the world, eager and willing to join and fight for the Empire. Though many of them had the same strange question: do we get Gundams? I've since learned they were referring to large robotic suits, a silly idea overall, but I do see the entertainment in it for a war race. The human leaders had no choice but to accept the Empire's offer and to begin integrating at once. But that's when the problem started. First, they changed the design of the small plasma rifle drone, finding some way to incorporate it into the armor we had designed for them. It now sits on the shoulder and has been connected to the neural link, allowing the humans to fire with line of sight, targeting faster and more effectively than we ever thought possible. When I saw this, I was incensed. I thought I hit it well, but my dorsal vents release of hot air showed up too clearly in the human biosphere on the ships. They said steam was pouring out of my ears. When I asked them why, all they said to me was, "Dude, predator." And that was just the start of it. Chapter 2. Within the first 2 weeks, the modifications humans made to their equipment and our ships had gone from strange to downright insane. They removed the acceleration caps on every small ship, so when accelerating fully, they would produce 5 times the force of Earth's gravity on the pilot. And worse, they had strung several of them together like one of their trains, a vehicle they had used for large cargo movement, and seemed to be using it to train children on piloting. They called it a space coaster. I observed one of these training simulations, watched this space coaster perform impractical moves even for a dogfight, and while I still don't understand, I suppose that's why my species is better suited to be researchers than warriors. The human children seemed to enjoy what, to me, looked terrifying. I decided at that point it would be best for me to stop overseeing the modifications humans were making. Zach Nar agreed with me and strangely took my place as lead research liaison. He had said something about creative engineering being interesting, but like usual, I assumed he was speaking in riddles. Instead, I got to work on the nutrient system. Our replicators were the pride of my species when the Empire brought us in, a device able to break down non-edible matter into its base chemical components and recombine them into a nutritious paste. The humans weren't fond of it, though some of the older ones said it was better than MREs, which I understood to be a compliment in comparison to their own nutrient replicators. Alas, adapting it to produce things the humans found appealing was no small feat. I wish I could say I had completed this task before the humans needed me to. But less than 1 full Earth month into their integration, the Keth struck again. I sat in the communications center with representatives from several species of the Empire. Mineral expert Angeli, a prugel, small in stature compared to the humans, though most of us were. Their noses could smell various ores and they truly enjoyed extracting them, sometimes doing so only with the keratin protrusions on their upper appendages. Senator Bragaxna, a Horgan, her feathers were as beautiful to behold as I had always heard. It made sense why they had developed most of the Empire's culture, Zach Nar as a research representative, and 6 humans, who called themselves the United Command. These, in contrast to their United Nations, did in fact seem united. They even wore similar clothing. I brought up the video from Norzax 4 and gave a brief description, my voice being fed through the translators into each of the representatives' ears. Norzax 4 is a moon around the gas giant Norzax, approximately 204.679 light-years from our current position. While it is a border world of the Empire, it is a full-fledged member and not a simple resource outpost. I could hear Angeli snort in disapproval, but I continued on. All the surface recording devices were destroyed except for the one that we received this record from, which was left completely intact. I started playback on the recording. A 3D projection of a small portion of the city grew on the table, showing a mass of Keth walking through, killing anything that moved. One of them, apparently a war leader, walked forward and the projection refocused, so he stood on the table. "Nixley, send us your warriors. We wish to give our children a plaything," it growled before grabbing a small Horgan running by and forcing open its beak. I cut the playback at that moment. I knew the barbarism that would follow would be too much. Senator Bragaxna was shaking. I was unsure if it was rage or similar to the human's expression of sadness. My species did our best to keep our emotions hidden, but it had turned out the air releases from my dorsal vents were more visible to humans than I would have liked. So as you can see, we may have to step up our timetable for integration of the human species. "Admiral Johnson, how many ships are ready?" spoke the human closest to the head of the table, a male of the species, showing some signs of age but in apparent good health overall. 3 frigates, 2 destroyers, and a carrier. Full fighter load for the carrier, so 52 fighters, sir," replied a dark-skinned human woman across the table. The aged human male nodded. "Jump, Master?" He turned his head to a gruff human male. "I have more trained Marines than we could even consider deploying, Hell, at this point, it'll be hard trying to stop them all from going. Good, he said as he turned his eyes back to the table. Can you bring the recording back up to when the big guy was standing here? I complied, pressing a few buttons to the moment before the war leader had grabbed the Horgan. At its full height, it would have been about half again as big as a human, but the projection showed it on a much smaller scale. It wore a dark armor over most of its body, but one could still clearly make out 4 upper limbs and thick lower ones. Its face had multiple mandibles and 6 individual compound eyes on its head, so it had no blind spots. Is that tail prehensile? An elderly female human. I later learned they called her Doc, though I'm not sure why. We're uncertain, I replied. Based on the keratin protrusions, we assume it's more of a bashing instrument than a limb. And all their weapons are energy-based? She asked. Yes, I said. Though it seemed a strange question, the humans did have a fondness for ballistics, but that was prior to being elevated to spacefaring, where everyone used energy weapons due to the volatility required for ballistic projection. The aged human spoke again. Tell the 82nd 101st, Night Witches, 1st Commandos, and the Jagger Regiment were wheels up at 800, he said as he rose from his chair. I grew confused. Surely you're not suggesting deploying now, I asked. We still have years of integration even with an advanced timetable, and we haven't even finished the nutrient replicators. The aged human turned to me. We'll eat the goddamn toothpaste. The air released from my dorsal vents was cold enough to nearly freeze the moisture in the air. Had we made something even worse than the Keth? Chapter 3. Sergeant White stood on the bridge of the single Nix Hill frigate that had been modified for humans. He was somewhat unique in that when the offer to join the Empire came out, he did not volunteer. He had seen the horrors of war as a medic for the United States Army Rangers, and had no wish to see more. But when Zach Nar reviewed all human records during the initial days of integration, he sent a request for Sergeant White to join the integration and development team. He thought an electrical engineer with a military background would prove particularly useful. He had seemed so excited in the message that Sergeant White didn't have the heart to tell the alien that he mostly just built boutique guitar pedals. He watched out the view screens as the small human fleet was preparing to depart. The ships would have to travel sublight to Mars before the skip jump. Doing it too close to Earth could disrupt the planet's atmosphere, not to mention the massive space docks where hundreds more ships were being modified to assist in this conflict if it lasted. He was brought from his thoughts by Senator Bragaxna speaking. Her natural voice was a soft, warbling song, not unlike the parakeets his mother had kept. He felt a bit disappointed that the translators removed the beauty from the words. You humans are very strange, rushing headlong into battle at the first opportunity, he replied as he looked towards her. If you look at our history, we always want to be the good guys, fighting evil and winning. It's been a gray concept in most human wars, but you finally gave us a chance to do it. Her feathers shifted as her translator made his words into chirps and trills. I'm not sure I understand fighting evil. The Keth aren't evil. They are simply a war species, much like your own. The trills sounded less degrading than the words themselves. Sergeant White grunted. We don't slaughter children on video. Slaughter children? You saw the video. They grabbed that kid of your species and shoved a blaster in its beak. Oh. There was almost an amusement in the Horgan's song. That wasn't a child. My species comes in all shapes and sizes, but our young don't have full plumage. Sergeant White hesitated before he spoke again. So it was just short? Yes. The song was definitely amused now. Well, too late to turn back now. He chuckled as he found a seat and began to strap in. You might want to put on a seatbelt. The senator looked confused at first but found a seat and strapped in like the others around her. Commander Rodriguez began firing off the pre-flight checklist to the ensigns and other control staff, before giving the command to move out. The initial acceleration was strong, but only lasted a few seconds. Moving from orbit up to reasonable speeds created significant force, but the inertial dampeners on the ship did a good job at keeping all inside it safe. It was only about 2 Gs. Everyone heard the senator retch. It was strange considering how bird-like she seemed. Sergeant White wasn't even sure if birds on Earth could vomit, but what hit the floor was definitely vomit. Alien vomit. Oh, neat. he thought to himself as he removed his seatbelt and went to comfort the senator. Zaknar disconnected his flotation device from where it had linked to a nearby console. His voice rang in Sergeant White's head. "You were quite right. That was fun. And as I understand, Senator Bernakska's reaction is in fact part of the fun." Sergeant White chuckled softly as Commander Rodriguez came over. "I'm so sorry, Senator. I should have warned you," the commander said as she offered a warm towel to the senator to clean herself. "That's a pretty low force for us, and I didn't think about the non-human crew." Her eyes grew wide and she pushed the comm button on her chest. "All human crew of Nixil Empire Ship Classic, this is your commander. Check on all non-human crew. If anyone is in need of medical assistance, please escort them to medbay." She spoke quickly, terrified she had just solidified herself as not being considerate towards the other species in the Empire. "Oh yes, the Galgians in the engine room will all likely need to be restabilized. A force like that would have disrupted the fluid balance, and it will take time for them to reset." Zaknar used the projector on his flotation device to speak out loud to the commander. He found it distasteful, but had been informed by most of the humans that they found the physic communication he preferred distasteful. Sergeant White stood and began to follow Zaknar down to the engine room. The Gallians were technically hive-mind creatures, though each one was its own little colony, kind of like ants when they group together to float on water. They looked somewhat like algae. Incredible mechanics considering they could get to every part of an engine that could be exposed to their fluids. When the doors to the engine room slid open, everything seemed to be at peace, though. Petty Officer Scott stood in front of what looked like an aquarium, where a floating green mass seemed annoyed. "What do you mean it was a bad idea? It worked, didn't it?" Petty Officer Scott was yelling at the tank. A deep voice emanated from a speaker connected to the tank. "Not causing significant harm does not mean inherent success." "What's going on here?" Sergeant White cut in. Petty Officer Scott turned, snapping to attention, but relaxed seeing the sergeant and Zaknar. "Oh, it's only you." He breathed in relief. "I made Greenie and his friends here get in one section and pressurized it before the acceleration. And now it's mad and telling me it wasn't a good idea." He gestured towards the tank with his thumb. Sergeant White could hear Zaknar giggling psychically. "You humans have such creative problem-solving." Chapter 4. "We don't like to touch each other." The green mass in the tank bellowed over the speakers. "Well, I wasn't going to wait an hour for you to regain control of all your bits," the petty officer said, gesturing toward the lower parts of the tank where some small green masses floated separately from the main mass of the galleon. "Diagnostic report," Sergeant White barked, fearing this may become an incident he would have to involve the HR team in if he let it go on. Zaknar seemed to inherently understand the feeling as he shot a message into the sergeant's brain. "Yes, this is dangerously close to the thing your species calls racism, and that Toby person is just insufferable." "Bluey and Red are checking now," Scott said as he pulled a tablet from a holster on his hip. "Initial diagnostics are looking good. We're only at 9% light speed, but it's harder than we've ever pushed any of these engines, and they seem to be holding steady mate." "You forget your military barring," a gruff voice shouted from the doors of the room. Petty Officer Scott snapped to attention, and Sergeant White whirled around. Master Sergeant Lee stood, his uniform perfectly pressed, just inside the door. He was a fairly tall man, career military before the integration. "Master Sergeant, what's up, homie?" Sergeant White said with a grin. Everyone could see the man stiffen, the rage built quickly in him. "Sergeant White, you need to treat your superiors with respect. I am your commanding NCO." "Actually," Zaknar's voice came from the speakers on his flotation device, "I am." He paused for a moment but felt the need to explain. "This is the integration and research vessel. It is not a military one. As such, it exists to better serve my team in integrating your species into the Empire. As the human voice on my team, Sergeant White is second only to me, but the sole purpose of this vessel is to adapt the technologies the Empire has given to human use. That's why it is unarmed." Zaknar could feel all three humans shift uncomfortably. He had expected that from the Master Sergeant. In fact, he had been excited to perform one of these shows of power he had learned of. He thought it would gain him respect among the humans. "Sergeant White?" He spoke directly into the man's head for guidance. The sergeant was one of the few humans who seemed to prefer the mental communication, said it made things faster. so he was very surprised when the sergeant replied out loud. "Hey, sorry, buddy. We're armed to the teeth." He responded. The other two seemed to relax at this. "Only with defensive weapons, though," Master Sergeant Lee shot in. "You know that's bullshit." Sergeant White shot back. "The rounds aren't any fucking softer." "Rounds?" Zaknar asked through his speakers. "Oh yeah, it's amazing." Petty Officer Scott joined in the exchange. "It was actually White's idea. We converted the bolt drivers you use for ship construction into rail guns, and also the fusion engine that heats the ship was easy to replicate for bombs." Zaknar immediately opened a larger mental link with Sergeant White, the one they used to share details of ideas and feelings rather than just words. It could be problematic as human thought was unlike his own species, but it functioned well enough after practice that he and Sergeant White could exchange ideas quickly. But what he felt was absolutely horrifying. 6 barrels spinning around a central point, the magnetic accelerators of the bolt driver with no safety limiter, chunks of ore being spit forward from it in rapid session. He felt Sergeant White's memory of the tests, watched the projectiles rip apart a meteor, and felt disappointment that the weapon was practically silent. All the large ships had been armed with this. Even the infantry carried a smaller version. "That's why you requested all those bolt drivers?" Zaknar asked over his speakers. "You're armed with them?" "It was assumed if the Keth use energy weapons, they may not be prepared for physical ones, sir," the Master Sergeant responded. "That's actually a reasonable hypothesis." Zaknar made the soft noise Sergeant White had learned was laughter. "You're such a creative people." "Diagnostics complete," a new voice from the tank said. Zaknar and Sergeant White turned back towards the tank, seeing the green mass had now been accompanied by a bluish one and a red one. "All systems functioning within normal limits," the speaker said. "Excellent," Sergeant White replied. "Scott, next time, each one in their own section and pressurize them individually, maybe?" "That would be acceptable." The Galians replied. It felt like in unison, but the translator to the speaker in their tank didn't really distinguish voices, and with each of the colonies having a few thousand voices, it would have been hard to tell anyway. "Master Sergeant, don't be too hard on Scott. We're trying to create a more relaxed atmosphere here," the sergeant said as he walked past the man and out the door, into the long corridor to the lift. He heard the man grunt in disapproval, but he simply continued walking. "What else have you kept from me?" Zaknar's voice rang in his head. He could feel the annoyance. "I'm not upset that the ship was armed, but you should have told me about it." "Yeah, sorry about that. But we don't exactly know what we're getting into here, and it's better to be safe than sorry." The sergeant thought back. "So, no more surprises?" Sergeant White laughed. "Man, just wait till you see the heavy." Even with only the limited mental link opened, he knew some of his excitement leaked out. "The what?" Chapter 5. The doors to the hangar whooshed open with a depressed sigh. "Why would you program it to do that?" Zaknar's voice rang into Sergeant White's head. "We thought it would be funny," he thought back. "You said you read almost all of human literature. You can't have skipped Hitchhikers. Adams should have been really high up in the list." "Oh, I did read that. There was just so much." The thought trailed off. Zaknar wasn't sure how to describe the fact that the vast majority of human media seemed to be depictions of reproductive acts. "I can see how individual references could get lost in the totality." The sergeant thought back, much to the gooey mass's relief. Part of him wanted to continue the conversation, his species reproduced by division, each new child a continuation of the parent, with all the cellular memory intact. Even the species he had worked to integrate into the Empire didn't share this focus. But what he saw upon stepping into the hangar stopped him in his tracks. It stood a head taller than the average human. Thick armor plating covered it from head to toe. He could see hints of servos and micro-hydraulics glimpsing out beneath the gaps to allow movement of the limbs. It had an arsenal built into it, a plasma caster on the shoulder, what looked like induction coils built into the arms, and several built-in holsters for various weaponry. Beside each one on a stand sat the Gatling railguns similar to the ones Zaknar had seen in Sergeant White's mind on the ships. They didn't even look much smaller, and worse, there were 4 of them. This wasn't some modification of pre-existing Nixley technology. The humans had built these entirely on their own. "What you're feeling right now is called awe," Sergeant White said aloud. "These are the heavies." He continued as he strode up to one of them. A multi-purpose combat and construction exosuit. The wearer is capable of moving about 2 tons. Environmental protection from all various atmospheric conditions, radiation, chemicals, and biological weaponry. It can take a full volley from the heaviest ship weapons you had before we started building and testing it. Honestly, we had to design new ship-based weapons just to kill one. Zaknar couldn't find words. He had so many questions, but only one would come to the front of his mind. "Why do you call them heavies?" "Well, we couldn't agree on a name." A voice rang out from behind one of the armors as a woman with short red hair stepped out. "Bill wanted to call them power armor, but I wanted to call them Gundams. Bill argued they weren't big enough to be Gundams. I countered that they had too many features to be power armor, so finally we settled on heavy." "Zaknar, meet Dr. Robinson," Sergeant White said, gesturing to the woman. "The finest engineer I've ever had the pleasure of working with." "Bill, you can call me Nora in public, I keep telling you," the woman said back, but before the sergeant had a chance to respond, continued to speak. "By the way, I just finished the modifications to the retro thrusters you asked for. You should be able to independently fire them on the surface, but I don't know if they will have enough power for your idea." "Why do they have retro thrusters?" Zaknar cut in, using his speakers. "Oh, Zaknar, you can use the psychic link," Nora said before anyone could respond. "Bill's told me all about it, and it seems very efficient." Zaknar wasn't sure, but she seemed to be smirking. He braced himself and opened the link between the 3 of them. It was always jarring establishing the link with a new mind. There would always be a temporary flood of emotions and non-consecutive thoughts before it was filtered. Humans even more so than other species. This one actually felt quite pleasant, though. But for some reason he couldn't help but recognize Sergeant White's arms, and how they appeared comfortable, or Nora's smile, and how it seemed to hide something fun but wicked. "Oh," Zaknar's first conscious thought into the link, "you two are mates." Sergeant White blushed, but everyone could feel Nora's amusement. To the matter at hand, Sergeant White thought as he began to play the way the heavies would be deployed, an orbital drop directly into the heart of the city. "Are you insane?" Zaknar couldn't even stop himself from thinking it. "You can't drop into the center of the city. We need to land a force in a safe location and make our way to the edge in a show of force. That's how it's always been done." "There's too great a risk of civilian casualties," the sergeant thought back. "Dropping into the city is the only way to minimize losses." Zaknar was so taken aback by the initial plan that it wasn't until after that he registered something even more horrifying. "Wait, why does the drop feel like I'm with you? We're not combatants." He thought, surely it had to be a mistake. In order to imagine it, the set had to put himself in the shoes of the soldiers who would be doing it. "You're not," was all Sergeant White had time to think back before Nora's thought cut in. "Bill's suit is specially modified with a containment unit for you in the chest. You'll have full view of everything going on and be able to more accurately lead human integration. On top of that, the unit is fully detachable in the event of damage to the suit and can be sent directly back here." "Humans are truly insane," Zaknar thought before a voice came over the ship's speaker. "Skip jump initiating in 5, 4. "Do we need to brace ourselves?" Zaknar thought, worried about what the humans may have done to the skip drives. 3, 2. "No," the pair thought in unison. 1. Chapter 6. All of reality blinked around him, and Zaknar let respiration out of his skin he didn't realize he had been holding. The familiarity of a normal skip jump was something he almost didn't expect but was quite grateful for. He was about to express this gratitude when he realized that Sergeant White had already stepped into one of the heavies, and several others had entered the room. Gone was Dr. Robin's playful, chatty demeanor. Instead, she was now commanding several technicians who were helping get the heavy pilots suited. Without breaking from her orders, she thought to Zaknar, "Your pod has an auto-dock feature to transfer you into the suit." It was jarring hearing her command him how to connect to it in his head, as she relayed a checklist to the technicians that his translator fed into his pod. He floated over and his pod connected just at the base of Sergeant White's helmet into the chest. He got one good look at the man's brown eyes behind the visor of the smooth face mask, almost featureless besides the visor, and 2 hoses running out of a panel in the center. It was frankly terrifying to look in the face. He felt himself slurped out of his pod and into a new container. It was a different shape, holding his gooey body as a flat sheet rather than a mass. Strangely comfortable, though a position he had never been in. Stranger still, he could feel the limbs of the suit. It went beyond the psychic link he shared with the sergeant. He could feel fingers, feel the strength of the grip. It was truly an odd sensation. He was about to ask about it when 4 different voices spoke in his head. He didn't even have time to try to separate them before he heard Sergeant White's voice ring in his head. "Come on, y'all, we fucking practice this. One at a time from right to left, for fuck's sake. Sergeant Johnson Green on all systems." A voice responded in Zaknar's head with the precision he had come to expect from humans who had been soldiers prior to integration. "Corporal Alberg, green and locked." The woman's mental voice followed like the beating of Sergeant White's heart Zaknar still couldn't filter from his head. "Sergeant White, green." The familiar sensation of the man's thoughts brought a small moment of peace before the next voice rang out. "Lieutenant Hams, green. And thank you for taking charge a moment ago, Sergeant. Remember, as the NCOIC of this fire team, I rely on you." Zaknar could tell there was something behind the words. It felt like one of the human power struggles he had been so interested in, but disappointed when he got to participate in one. "Absolutely, sir," Sergeant White responded. Zaknar didn't feel a hint of argument in the tone and was about to ask before the man continued. "Just remember, I keep these rabble in line. Johnson does land nav and you put in the paperwork for awards." He could feel all 3 of the other soldiers laugh. He wasn't sure if it was the psychic link or simply the words, but he felt something he never had before, trust and respect. He knew Sergeant White believed wholeheartedly that these people would die before letting Zaknar come to harm. Part of him was worried about the lack of self-preservation he felt in Sergeant White, but also comforted. "Bay doors opening." Dr. Robin's voice cut him from his thoughts. It couldn't have been that quick. How were they already in orbit? He felt an emotion that was almost a complete stranger to him, a mix of fear and excitement, as the 4 stepped to the edge of the hangar and looked through the force field to the world below. "May the road rise up to meet us." That was all Sergeant White said before he stepped into the black. Chapter 7. They were falling, but Zaknar didn't feel any fear. He wasn't sure if his own fear wasn't just drowned out by the pure unbridled joy coming from the humans, or by the woo screeching through the speakers in the suit coming from Lieutenant Ham's transmitter. He would have to try to remember to ask if the vocal response was simply involuntary, considering the suits seemed to allow for the humans to communicate psychically. He would also have to remember to ask about how the suits had that capability as well, because he knew humans had no psychic capabilities on their own. But for now, there was a constant feed of thought and emotion bleeding into his mind from Sergeant White. Each new item that popped into his vision, ammo count for the rail Gatling, armor integrity for the suit, hydronic pressure and temperature for its movement, fuel for the retro thrusters. It felt like an eternity they were falling, but it was only a few minutes before the retro thrusters fired to slow their descent. Even with the slowing, they landed hard enough to crack the marble floor of the Capitol building steps they landed on. The corporal seemed to have landed on some sort of black goo, but Zaknar realized as the HUD lit up with life forms, they had dropped directly into the Keth command center. The 4 were up in an instant, their backs together and their rail Gatlings firing, each a wide sweep covering the quadrant in front of them. As the whirring of the guns died down, Zaknar felt Sergeant White's eyes sweeping the land before him. Several Keth lay dead, their heads broken by the bolts. Others seemed wounded, but heavily injured. The walls of the buildings surrounding them stood in tatters. There was a slight whistle in the air. Then Zaknar awoke, back in his pod in the infirmary of the NES Classic. Dr. Robin sat next to the bed his pod hovered slightly over, her eyes red and tired. "What happened?" He let the speakers of his pod translate his thoughts to words, but still saw them shock the woman. "Oh, thank the goddess," she sobbed. "I was so worried we'd lost you too." "Too? Doctor, I know this is unusual, but I'm confused." Zaknar's speakers fed out. "Last I knew I was riding in Sergeant White's suit. We had just landed and attacked, and now I'm here." "You lost consciousness." The translator spoke out as a white-coated Manison stepped forward and bubbled between its tentacles as they did. Frankly, we didn't even know that was possible for your species and feared the worst. You've been under observation for 6 hours. Zaknar didn't even have words. His species didn't even sleep. He supposed this unique experience answered the question of whether life should only be measured as periods of consciousness. He felt like he was the same Trill who had been in the suit with Sergeant White, even with the interrupted consciousness. "What happened?" he said through the speakers. "There's a transmission that came in not long after your pod arrived." Dr. Robin's voice shook as she spoke. "The command said it was above my clearance level to hear." Zaknar's pod lifted farther from the bed and began moving toward the door. "Come along," he thought into the doctor's mind. He almost regretted it as the psychic link was flooded with another human emotion he normally wouldn't feel. Grief. But it was contrasted with a beautiful hope. The Manison bubbled some protest behind them, but Zaknar's pod was already too far out for the translators to relay it. He floated through the halls towards the command center. He reached its door, and it slid open with a familiar beep. The humans of the integration team hadn't reprogrammed this one. "I said we weren't to be disturbed." A dark-skinned woman Zaknar recognized as Admiral Johnson of the Human United Chiefs shouted as the door opened. "I apologize for the interruption." The words came out over Zaknar's pod speakers, but it was simply unavoidable as a result of the structure of the door. He floated into the room towards a seat at the head of the table currently occupied by Senator Bragaxna. "However, as this vessel is the chief human integration vessel of the Nixil Empire, and I am the chief officer of human integration, I'm required to conduct this meeting," he continued as he floated next to the Horgan's shoulder. "Though I do appreciate the senator sitting in during my period of incapacity." The senator began to stand, but Zaknar interrupted her. "Oh, you may remain in the seat, Senator. I don't require one, and don't care for the ceremony surrounding it, but I do appreciate the symbolic nature." He felt Dr. Robin's voice tickle in his head. That was impressive. He thought back, a sadness in his mind. "Bill told me I should be aggressive in these power struggles." Referring to the sergeant as such felt both sad and wrong, but he wasn't sure he understood why. Admiral Johnson's laugh broke the tension in the room. "Zaknar, I think all that time under psychic link with a human may have had some side effects, but honestly I like it. You motherfuckers have always been too pussyfoot for my taste," she said. The other chiefs on hologram appeared to have faces of either shock or approval. The older male Zaknar, recognized as being in charge of the United Chiefs, cleared his throat before saying simply, "Language, Admiral." The man Zaknar remembered as Jumpmaster broke into a hearty laugh. Zaknar cut in before the man could express anything else, though. "Well, I need to comprehend the situation, so as Sergeant White would say, report." He tried to bark the last word in the way he had heard the sergeant do to instantly get everyone back on track. Something about it was lost with the combination of translators and speakers, but it still seemed effective. 6 hours and 28 minutes ago, the shock troops dropped into the area we identified as a likely Keth tactical headquarters. Admiral Johnson began to speak. 5 minutes after landing, Lieutenant Ham's life sign stopped reporting and Sergeant White disconnected your containment unit and it returned to the ship. 2 hours ago, we received the following transmission. Shelby said, signaling to the Calvid standing in the corner. It shifted its many appendages. Zaknar half wondered if humans could see the color of the movement of its limbs, but stopped the train of thought to focus. When the red at the tip of his sixth most left line touched the console and turned blue, a recording started to play from the table. He recognized the feed as from Sergeant White's helmet. "Zaknar!" his voice screamed, the desperation palpable. "Fuck, Zaknar is out, detaching now. All switch to vocal transmission." Zaknar watched as the feed showed a sheet of transparent metal float up before the sergeant's face. "Don't you dare fucking die," he heard the sergeant say over the recording. "And just in case you can feel this, tell Nora." The voice paused, but Zaknar felt a flood of emotion, dreams, and hopes. Images of children running as the two sat on chairs overlooking fields. Peace. He heard the doctor burst into tears next to him. Apparently, the psychic encoding was so strong that it leaked through the link to her. Zaknar wanted to comfort her, but he wasn't sure if that wasn't some imprint from Sergeant White bleeding through as well. He would have to study the human psychic link far more deeply in the future. The recording continued to play where after a brief second, Sergeant White barked, "Report. Armor integrity at 23%, my left leg is fucked. Luckily the nanites have stopped the bleeding, but I'm not sure it isn't hamburger below the knee." The corporal's voice rang out. "Hams is dead, Billy." Sergeant Johnson's voice came over the recording. "What the hell did they hit us with?" "I don't know, Ty." Zach Nar could hear a fear in the man's voice even through the recording. "Can either of you fire the retro thrusters?" "I think so," Corporal Alberg said. "Good, both of you get to Charlie Point. We should have drop ships in by the time you get there," Sergeant White said, turning and positioning himself in front of the corpse of the lieutenant. "I'll take care of Hams." The recording cut as the distinct whir of the Gatling railgun spinning up came through.